There is a particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. I know it better than most people do. I knew it at age 5, when I stopped waiting by the window of room 4B at Hansung Children's Home, watching the gate with big eyes every visiting day, half hoping that maybe today would be the day someone came for me. I knew it at 12, when the couple who had spent 6 months getting close to me chose the baby girl in the room next door instead. A softer choice, a simpler one. I knew it at 18, when I stood at the door of that orphanage for the very last time with one duffel bag over my shoulder, 30,001 in my pocket, and absolutely nowhere to go. No one waved goodbye. The director, a woman named Mrs. Choi with reading glasses perpetually pushed to the end of her nose, handed me a small envelope. Inside was a letter of completion from the state, proof that I had aged out of the system, and a pamphlet about social services I could apply to. She shook my hand, firm and businesslike, the way you shake the hand of someone you will never see again. "Good luck, young Sana," she said. And that was it. I had spent 18 years in that building. I had eaten 3,000 breakfasts in its dining hall. I had cried into 17 different pillows and 17 different beds as younger children were chosen and went home with warm families. I had washed dishes, mopped floors, helped the smaller kids with their homework, sung lullabies to the babies when the night staff was too busy. That place had raised me after a fashion. It had kept me alive, fed me, given me a roof. But no one had ever looked at me the way parents look at the child they chose. I used to wonder about my mother. Every child in that place did. We were all experts at wondering. The file I was eventually allowed to see when I turned 16 said her name was Han Jisoo. She had been 20 years old when she had me. She had signed the relinquishment papers 3 weeks after my birth. Under reason for relinquishment, someone had written, "Unable to provide adequate care." A civil servant's version of the truth, I supposed. Polite. Bloodless. What it didn't say was that she had looked at me and decided I was a mistake she could not afford to keep. I did not hate her, not then. I had spent years carefully constructing a version of the story I could live with. She had been young. She had been scared. She had made the decision she thought was best. People do desperate things under desperate circumstances, and she had been just a girl, really 20 years old with a newborn she hadn't planned for. I told myself that story so many times it almost felt true. The day I walked out of Hansung Children's Home, I made myself one promise. I would not be a burden to anyone. I would not become someone who needed rescuing. Whatever came next, I would handle it with my own 2 hands. The first year was the hardest. I found a part-time job at a convenience store within 3 days of leaving the orphanage. The owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Yoon, hired me after a 5-minute interview because I showed up on time, looked him in the eye, and said I was willing to work any shift including overnight. He paid cash under the table and let me take the food that was going to be thrown away at closing time. I slept in a gazuwan near Dongdaemun, a study hall dormitory room barely bigger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a small desk, and a window that overlooked a concrete wall. But it was mine. That mattered more than I could explain to anyone who had never not had something that was theirs. I enrolled in a culinary program at a community college 2 months later, taking night classes after my daytime shift. I had always been drawn to cooking, not just because food is sustenance but because it is care made visible. Back in the orphanage when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, I had started helping in the kitchen when the cook was short-handed. There was something profoundly satisfying about transforming raw ingredients into something warm and nourishing. You could not do it halfway. It required attention, patience, and the willingness to put something of yourself into what you made. I liked that. I needed something that required all of me in order to work. By 22 I had my culinary certificate and a job as a line cook at a mid-range Korean restaurant in Mapo. By 24 I was sous chef. By 26 I was managing the kitchen almost entirely by myself. I was not rich. I never had been and I had never expected to be. But I was capable and I was independent and I paid my own bills and slept in my own bed. A real bed now in a small studio apartment I rented in Siademan, and that felt like an enormous victory over everything that could have gone wrong. My omega biology was the one thing I had never quite figured out how to fit into my life. I presented at 20, late for most omegas. The social worker at the orphanage had told me late presentations were sometimes associated with suppressed stress responses, which was a clinical way of saying that my body had been so busy surviving that it had delayed the luxury of presenting. I kept my designation quiet. In Seoul's professional world, omega men were sometimes treated like delicate things, assumed to be either helpless or predatory, always in the market for an alpha to attach themselves to. I wanted neither the pity nor the assumption. I took my suppressants every month and got on with my life. I was 28 years old and alone in the best possible way, not lonely, just solitary, when the night that changed everything arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in October. The restaurant closed late that Tuesday because of a private booking that ran over by an hour and a half. By the time I finished cleaning the kitchen, changing out of my chef's whites and making it to the bus stop, it was past midnight. The buses were sparse at that hour. I stood under the orange haze of the street light and pulled my jacket tighter against the bite of the autumn air. I was thinking about nothing in particular, the menu changes I wanted to propose, whether I needed more rice from the market, if the leftover doenjang in my refrigerator was still good, when I turned the corner of a narrow side street and saw him. An old man. He was sitting on the cold ground of the alley, back against the wall of a building, knees drawn slightly up, hands resting on his thighs. He wore what was clearly an expensive coat, dark wool, well cut, the kind that did not come from any discount rack, but it was rumpled now and one of his shoes had come untied. His white hair was neat but slightly disheveled, as if he had been out for a long time. His face, when I got close enough to see it clearly, was pale and drawn, and his eyes, dark, sharp eyes that would have been commanding under other circumstances, were clouded with something between confusion and exhaustion. Before we dive into this heartwarming, emotional, slow burn romance Omegaverse story, note, this is an original work of Milliflex channel. If seen in another channel that is not Milliflex, please report that channel for copyright and impersonation. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. He looked up at me when I stopped, and there was no fear in his face, just a tired kind of curiosity. Harabiaji, I said carefully, using the word for grandfather, which seemed natural even though he was a stranger. Are you hurt? My legs, he said, and his voice was still steady, still dignified. They got tired. I looked around. The alley was empty. No one was coming. I crouched down to his level. Have you been here long? He thought about it. I'm not sure. I was walking and then my legs wouldn't cooperate anymore. He didn't seem frightened of me. He studied my face the way very old people sometimes do, openly and without embarrassment, as though he had long since stopped caring about social protocol. You have a kind face, he said. Something in me, the part that had grown up going to sleep hungry for someone to say something simple like that, softened involuntarily. Let me help you up, I said. Can you walk if you lean on me? I think so. It took a moment because he was heavier than he looked and his legs truly were unsteady, but eventually we got him upright. He gripped my arm with surprising strength, the grip of a man who had been strong once and remembered it. Where do you live? I asked. He frowned slightly. I know the address, but I couldn't find it. I sometimes get turned around. He said it without shame, just matter-of-factly. I have a number. Someone will come if you call. My apartment is close, I said. You should sit down somewhere warm and rest before they come. Can you walk a little? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. My studio apartment was small enough that 2 people in it made it feel crowded, but it was warm and clean, and I settled the old man on my only proper chair, a second-hand wooden thing with a cushion I had made myself from leftover fabric, while I put the kettle on. I'm Young Sun, I said. Kwon Young Sunday. Park Sungjin, he said. People call me Harabiaji. Are you hungry, Harabiajinim? He tilted his head. I haven't eaten since lunch. I looked at the time. It was 12:40. He had been out since at least lunchtime, possibly longer, if the confusion had started earlier in the day. I thought about the food in my refrigerator, the leftover rice, the vegetables I had brought from the restaurant, the eggs. I'll make something simple, I said. Give me a moment. I scrambled eggs with green onion and sesame oil, heated the leftover rice, cut up a small plate of kimchi. Nothing fancy. But the old man ate everything I put in front of him with slow, deliberate satisfaction, and when he was done he folded his hands on the table and looked at me with those sharp dark eyes. You are very calm, he said. I was a chef, I said. Feeding people is what I do. Were you coming home from work just now? Yes. And you stopped for me? Yes. He nodded slowly as though this confirmed something he had suspected. Most people wouldn't. I didn't know what to say to that, so I poured the tea instead. After a while he gave me the number he'd mentioned. I called it from my phone and someone answered on the second ring. A young man's voice, efficient and alert in the way of someone who had been waiting. I explained where we were. The man on the other end asked me to stay with Harabiajinim until someone arrived, and I said of course. 40 minutes later, a large black car pulled up outside my building. A man in a suit, clearly security or a personal aide, came to my door and bowed, collected the old man carefully, and before Harabiajinim was let out, he stopped in my doorway and turned back to look at me. Thank you, Kwon Young Sunisai, he said, and the formality of it, from an old man in rumpled expensive clothing, was oddly touching. Take care of yourself, Harabiajinim, I said. He smiled. It was a small smile, but it reached his eyes, and it was the warmest thing that had happened to me in a very long time. I closed the door and went to bed. I thought that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, someone knocked on my door. It was a Sunday morning. I was in the middle of making myself juk, plain rice porridge, the comfort food I always made on days I wasn't working, a habit from the orphanage where juk appeared whenever someone was sick or sad. I had my hair undone, falling around my face in dark waves, and I was wearing a loose cream sweater that I had owned for so long the cuffs were soft from washing. I looked, in other words, nothing like a person expecting company. When I opened the door, Park Sung-jin was standing there with a small paper bag in his arms and a calm expression that suggested he saw nothing at all unusual about appearing at the apartment of a stranger he had met once at midnight. Behind him, at a respectful distance in the corridor, stood the same suited aide from before. "Harabiajinim," I said, genuinely startled. "How did you find?" "I have resources," he said simply and held out the paper bag. "These are for you." I wanted to thank you properly. I accepted the bag. It was heavier than it looked, and stepped back. "Please come in." He came in. The aide remained in the corridor without being asked. In the bag were 2 tins of good green tea, a box of high-quality dried jujubes, and a small envelope. I opened the envelope and found inside it a card that said, in old-fashioned but precise handwriting, "You have a generous spirit. I hope life is generous to you in return. Park Sung-jin." I stood there holding the card, not quite sure what to say. "I interrupted your cooking," he said, looking at the pot on the stove. "Juk," I said. "Would you like some?" He sat down in my wooden chair again as naturally as if it were his own, and told me he would. I made enough for 2. We ate together at my small table, and he told me, unprompted, in the easy way of very old people who have long since stopped guarding their words, that he had a grandson. That the grandson was the most important person in his life. That the grandson was also, he admitted with a wry edge, something of a terror. "A terror how?" I asked. "In every way that matters professionally." He sipped his tea. "He is very capable. Very strong. People fear him. He has built his empire through force of will and intelligence, and he never apologizes for any of it." Pause. "But he is lonely. And he doesn't know how to stop being the person the world has decided he is in order to simply be a person." I wasn't sure what to say to that either. I thought about being a person that the world had decided something about you, the orphan, the omega, the boy no one had chosen, and I said nothing because some things you understand without needing to explain them. Harabiajinim left an hour later, and I thought again that was the end of it. But he came back. 2 weeks after that, and then 3 weeks after that. Always with something in his hands, fruit from a market he'd passed, a book he thought I might like, a small jar of honey from a beekeeper he knew. Always in the morning. Always for juk, or sometimes for the simple meals I made with whatever I had on hand. Always just the 2 of us at my small table, talking about nothing in particular and sometimes about things that mattered. Over those months I learned several things about Park Sung-jin. He was 73 years old. He had built a business empire in his 50s and 60s that he had largely handed off to his grandson 5 years ago. He had a complicated relationship with his health, which he discussed with the calm acceptance of someone who has already made a kind of peace with what is coming. He loved art, particularly traditional Korean paintings, and he had opinions about food that were strong and specific and sometimes contradictory. He had been married for 40 years to a woman he described as the wisest person I have ever known, and she had died 6 years ago, and he had not quite found his footing since. And I learned, gradually without being told directly, that his visits to my apartment were something close to the brightest part of his current days. I was not sure what to do with that. I was 28 and more or less alone in the world, and here was this old man who found something in me worth returning to, again and again, as faithfully as a tide. I had not had anything like family since I left the orphanage. The sensation of being sought out, of being somewhere someone wanted to be, was so unfamiliar it was almost uncomfortable. But I kept making the juk. And I kept opening the door. 5 months into our strange gentle friendship, Harabiajinim arrived one morning without his paper bag of gifts and sat down across from me with the air of a man who had made a decision. "I want to hire you," he said. I set down my tea. "I have a job." "I know. I want to hire you as my personal chef." He looked at me steadily. "I have a cook at the house, but she has been with me for 20 years and her knees are giving her trouble and she wants to retire, and I would rather have you. I know how you cook. I know who you are in the kitchen. I trust you." I stared at him. "Harabiajinim, I'm a line cook at a restaurant in Mapo. I'm not a private household chef. I don't have." "You have everything I need," he said simply. "The rest can be learned. And I will pay you considerably more than you are making now, with full accommodation at the Park family residence. Your own room, your own bathroom, full benefits. He folded his hands on my table. I am not a young man, young Sana, and I would like to spend what time I have left eating food made by someone who cooks with their whole heart. You do that. I've watched you. The whole heart part landed somewhere vulnerable in my chest. I thought about my studio apartment, which was mine but cost me 3/4 of my salary and was sometimes cold in winter because the heating was uneven. I thought about the restaurant kitchen, which I loved but where I was, at 28, already aging out of the physical demands of line work. I thought about this old man who came to my door with fruit and books and sat in my one chair eating my simple food as though it were the finest thing he had ever tasted. All right, I said. His expression didn't change much, just a slight deepening of the eyes, something that might have been satisfaction. Good, he said. Can you start Monday? The Park family residence was not what I was prepared for. I had known vaguely that Harabiajinim had money. The expensive coat, the suited aide, the large black car, these had told me something. But I had not quite extrapolated those details to their logical conclusion. The house, and it was a house, a proper house in a quiet, wealthy neighborhood in Gangnam, behind gates and a long driveway lined with carefully tended trees, was the most beautiful private residence I had ever been inside. Traditional Korean architecture blended with modern renovation. Dark wood beams, hanji screens, courtyards with stone lanterns, and inside high ceilings and clean white walls hung with exactly the kind of traditional paintings Harabiajinim had told me he loved. The kitchen was a chef's dream. Spacious, equipped with everything, supplied with ingredients I had only previously seen in high-end restaurant orders. I stood in the middle of it on my first morning and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that a place might suit me. The other staff were cautious with me at first, not unkind but watchful. There was a housekeeper named Mrs. Yeo, a small, precise woman in her 50s who ran the household with quiet authority, and several cleaning staff, a gardener, and 2 security personnel who I later learned were there specifically because of the grandson, who apparently required a level of security that most private residences did not. The young master doesn't live here, Mrs. Yeo told me on my first day, in a tone that managed to convey about 15 layers of information simultaneously. He has his own residence. He visits Harabiajinim sometimes. On those occasions, you will prepare whatever the Harabiaji requests and present it well. If the young master speaks to you, be respectful and brief. Of course, I said. He is. She paused, searching for a word. Exacting. He expects high standards. So do I said pleasantly. She studied me for a moment, and then something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, and she said, "Good," and walked away. I cooked Harabiaji's breakfast that morning. Doenjang jjigae made the way I had seen him enjoy it, with extra mushrooms and just a little more depth in the broth than was standard, rice, a small dish of spinach namel, and the green tea he preferred. I carried it to the room where he ate his morning meals, a sun-filled room with a view of the courtyard garden. He looked up when I came in, and his expression opened the way I had come to recognize, the face of a man receiving something he had genuinely been looking forward to. "Ah," he said. "Young Sana." "Harabiajinim," I said and set the tray down carefully. "Breakfast." He tasted the jjigae and closed his eyes for just a moment. "Perfect," he said quietly. I bowed and left to go clean the kitchen, and I felt, walking down that corridor, a satisfaction so clean and complete it was almost like joy. I learned within the first 2 months of working in that house that Harabiajinim was ill. He didn't tell me directly. I noticed it the way you notice things when you feed someone, the slow decreasing of appetite, the days when the broth had to be lighter because anything richer was too much, the way he sometimes sat a little too carefully, as if cataloging his own energy. Mrs. Yeo mentioned it obliquely once, in the way household staff speak around things they aren't supposed to discuss. He has good days and difficult days. The suited aide, whose name I eventually learned was Kim Jin-ho, and who turned out to be one of the most quietly competent people I had ever met, was more direct when I asked him point blank one morning. "He has a condition affecting his heart and kidneys," Jin-ho SSI said in the flat, factual tone of someone who had made peace with difficult information. "The doctors are managing it. But it is progressive." I nodded. I adapted the menus. I made the food lighter, more digestible, more nourishing in the specific ways his body needed. I researched. I asked careful questions when Harabiajinim was in a talkative mood about what he craved, what comforted him. I made his food from scratch, every meal, refusing to take shortcuts even on the days when I was tired. Harabiajinim noticed. Of course he noticed. He was a man who paid attention. One morning in early February, he asked me to sit down with him after breakfast, which he had never done before. I sat across from him at the low table in the sunlit room, the courtyard garden visible through the glass beyond him, and waited. He poured tea for both of us, which was also something he had never done. The pouring had always been mine. Then he looked at me with those eyes that saw too much and he said, "I want to ask you something, young son. And I want you to know that whatever you answer, I will respect it. Of course, Harabiajinim. I want you to marry my grandson." The room went very quiet. I stared at him. I began. "Let me explain first," he said calmly and lifted a hand. "Please." I closed my mouth. He told me about Moonbin. He told me about his grandson with the careful, clear-eyed love of a grandfather who knows his child's flaws as well as he knows their virtues, perhaps better. He told me that Moonbin was, by every professional and social metric, the most powerful man in Seoul, that his family's company, Moon Corporation, held assets across finance, real estate, and technology that made it one of the top 3 business empires in the country, and that Moonbin had driven it to that position himself, taking over at 25 and rebuilding it with a ferocity that had left competitors speechless and rivals afraid. "He is an alpha," Harabiajinim said. "The strongest I have ever known, and I have known many alphas in my lifetime. His aura is significant. Many people cannot be in the same room as him for long without becoming uncomfortable." "Why?" I asked quietly. "Because he doesn't mask it. He has never learned to, or perhaps he chose not to. He has never needed to." Harabiajinim looked into his tea. "He is not cruel. I want you to understand that. Moonbin is not a cruel man. He is hard, yes. He is demanding and impatient, and he has a way of making people feel that they are failing some standard they were never informed of. But he is not cruel. He is my grandson and he has my blood, and in here," he touched his chest. "He is good. I know it. But," I said because there was clearly a but he is completely alone. Harabiajinim's voice, for just a moment, lost its evenness. "Because of what he is, what the world sees when it looks at him, no one has ever stayed. The Omegas who have tried have run within weeks. The Alphas who could theoretically be companions have kept their distance. The Betas who don't respond to his aura at all have found him," he paused, "inhospitable. He does not know how to be soft, young Sana. He has never been required to be." I sat very still. "And you think I would be the right person for him?" I asked carefully. Harabiajinim looked at me then with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something very raw and very deliberate. "I have watched you for 7 months," he said. "I have seen you cook for me on your worst days without ever letting it show in the food. I have seen you adapt and problem solve and care, quietly, without announcement or recognition. I have seen you handle the unexpected and the difficult and the uncomfortable without flinching. You are not a fragile person, young Sana, whatever the world might think of you, because you are an Omega. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. And I truly believe, that you are the kind of person who could look at my grandson and see past the armor." My throat was very tight. "And I am running out of time," he said, simply and without self-pity. "I want to know he is not alone before I go. That is the honest truth of it. I want to know there is someone in his life who is there because of who he is, not what he has." The room was very quiet for a long time. I spent 3 days thinking about it. I walked along the Han River for 2 of those evenings, hands in my pockets, listening to the wind and watching the lights reflect off the water. I turned the request over and around in my mind like a stone I was trying to understand the weight of. Marriage. To a stranger. To the most frightening man in Seoul. The rational voice in my head, the one that had kept me alive since I was 18, said, "This is insane. You don't know this man. You don't owe the grandfather anything. Kindness repaid is not the same as lifelong obligation. You could be miserable. You could be." But there was a but. I had lived 28 years without anyone looking at me the way Park Sung-jin looked at me. Without anyone saying with complete seriousness and absolute conviction, "You are the right person. You are the one." Even if the context was strange, even if the request was unprecedented, I had never, not once in my entire life, been someone's first choice. And Harabiajinim was dying. I knew it in my bones, the way you know the things no one says directly. He was dying, and his greatest remaining grief was the thought of his grandson, this hard, armored, lonely man, being left entirely alone in the world. I thought about room 4B in Hansung Children's Home. About the window I had stopped watching. About what it felt like to be alone in a way that had no relief in sight. I went back on the 3rd day. "All right," I said. Harabiajinim looked at me for a long moment, and then he did something I had never seen him do. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine, and his fingers were cool and papery and slightly unsteady, and he said very quietly, "Thank you, young son." And somehow that, just that, was worth more to me than I could explain to anyone who hadn't lived my particular life. I met Moonbin for the first time 9 days before our wedding. Harabiajinim had, in the intervening weeks, arranged everything with the efficiency of a man who knows he is working against a clock. There had been legal documents, a prenuptial agreement that his lawyers handled with brisk professionalism, and several meetings between the two families' representatives. Though on my side there was no family, only me and a proxy lawyer Harabiajinim had appointed to act on my behalf, which felt at once very lonely and very efficient. Moonbin had been told what was happening. He had agreed. Harabiajinim relayed this information to me with the directness he used for everything. He promised me he would marry whoever I chose, Harabiajinim said. He is a man who keeps his promises. Does he know who I am? He knows your name and that you have been my chef for 7 months and that I trust you. He will form his own opinions when he meets you. Pause. Try not to be frightened of him. I'm not easily frightened, I said. Harabiajinim smiled. I know. That's one of the reasons I chose you. The meeting happened in the main sitting room of the park residence, on a Tuesday afternoon when the light came through the windows at a low autumn angle and turned everything golden. I was wearing the clothes Mrs. Yeo had diplomatically suggested I wear, a pale blue shirt, dark trousers, my hair combed back from my face, neater than I usually kept it. I felt, sitting on the sofa waiting, like a person about to face an interview for a job I wasn't sure I was qualified for. I heard him before I saw him. Not footsteps, or rather, not just footsteps. It was the shift in the atmosphere of the room that preceded him. Like a pressure change. Like the quality of the air itself rearranging. Then the door opened. Moonbin walked in and every rational thought I had briefly vacated the premises. He was, I don't have a better word for it, enormous. Not in terms of height exactly, though he was tall, easily taller than me, broad-shouldered and built with the solid density of a man who was physically as powerful as he was professionally. It was the presence. The sheer, undiluted presence of him filled the room the moment he entered it, the way a sound fills a space all the way to the edges. His face was angular and severe, the kind of face that might have been beautiful if it ever relaxed, with dark eyes that were sharp and evaluating and absolutely unimpressed by everything they looked at. He wore a dark suit with no tie, the collar of his shirt opened by one button, and he moved like someone who had never in his life questioned whether he had the right to take up space. He looked at me. I looked back at him. His eyes were, I noticed, not just dark but black, the true deep black of the night sky over Seoul on a clear winter night. They were assessing me in a way that was both uncomfortable and strangely detached, as if I were an equation he was working out. You are Kwon Young's son, he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and even and possessed of a quality that made the air in the room seem denser. Yes, I said. I was proud of how steady my voice came out. He crossed the room and sat in the armchair across from me, crossed one leg over the other, and continued to look at me with those unreadable black eyes. Harabiaji explained the situation, he said. He explained it to me as well. Then we both understand what this is. He said it the way you state a mathematical fact. No drama. No apology. A promise I made to my grandfather fulfilled. An arrangement that will make him rest easier. Yes, I said. A beat of silence. He studied me the way someone studies a map before deciding on a route. You were an orphan, he said. I didn't flinch, though something in me tightened. Yes. You have supported yourself since 18. No family connections. No assets. No social ties of significance. He said these things not cruelly but very factually, the way someone reads a report. That's correct, I said. You cook. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Infinitesimal, barely visible, but I was already, in those few minutes, becoming attuned to the smallest fluctuations in his face. Harabiaji says you cook extraordinarily well. I do, I said because I saw no point in false modesty. That, apparently, registered. The angle of his head changed fractionally, as if what he had expected was self-deprecation and received instead something else. I will not be a difficult husband, he said, in the sense that I will not make your life deliberately unpleasant. You will have everything you need and most of what you want, materially. I am rarely at home. You will not be required to perform as a spouse publicly beyond what is minimally necessary. He paused. In exchange, I ask that you be honest, that you not embarrass me or my family's name, and that you fulfill the commitment you are making to my grandfather. It was the least romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. And yet, I detected, underneath the clinical delivery of it, something that might have been, in someone who had learned to armor every soft thing, an offering. An honest one. I can agree to all of that, I said. And I have my own terms. His eyes sharpened. Go on. Mutual respect, I said. I won't diminish you. I ask the same in return. I'm not a decoration or a convenience. And I paused and then said the thing I had been turning over for days. I am not going to spend this marriage being afraid of you. I understand what you are. I am asking you to understand what I am. The room was very quiet. Moonbin looked at me for a long, assessing moment, and then, and this was the first truly unexpected thing he had done, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More the ghost of the idea of one. Understood, he said. The wedding was small. Harabiajinim had insisted on a ceremony rather than a simple registration, and so we were married in a private ceremony at the Park family residence 12 days later, with only Harabiajinim, Kim Jinho, Mrs. Yeo, and 3 other household staff as witnesses. Moonbin's own people, his personal aide, a woman named Han Seri who had the focused energy of someone who ran a small country, stood on his side. I wore white because Harabiajinim had asked me to, and because I had decided if I was going to do this I was going to do it fully. Moonbin wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, his hair pushed back from his face. Standing beside him at the low ceremonial table, I was very aware of his height, the warmth that came off him in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature and everything to do with the alpha biology I was absolutely refusing to react to. My suppressants were doing their job. I was perfectly fine. When we bowed together and the officiant pronounced us married, I glanced sideways at him. He was already looking at me. His expression was opaque. But he did not look displeased. Afterward, Harabiajinim held my hands in both of his and said, quietly so only I could hear, "You are very brave, young son. I want you to know I see it." I swallowed. I managed a smile. "Take care of yourself, Harabiajinim," I said. "That's what I want." He squeezed my hands and let go. The master residence of Moonbin was a penthouse. It was on the 41st floor of a building in Cheongdam-dong, and it occupied the entire top floor and it was, I had no other word for it, stark. Everything was either white or charcoal or black, every surface either glass or stone or dark wood. The furniture was expensive and precise and completely without warmth. The view from the enormous windows was breathtaking, Seoul spreading out in every direction like a lit circuit board, the Han River a dark ribbon below, the mountains a shadowy suggestion at the edges. At night it was extraordinary. During the day it was impressive. But it did not feel like anyone lived there. I was shown to what was introduced to me as my room, a large room with a walk-in wardrobe and an ensuite bathroom and a bed that was larger than my entire previous studio apartment. Everything in it was already arranged, as if someone had prepared it with the information that I was coming but no information about who I actually was. The walls were bare. The wardrobe had a selection of clothing in various sizes, someone's estimate of what an Omega my build might wear, still tagged. I stood in the middle of it and breathed. All right, I told myself. This is manageable. This is fine. Moonbin's own room was at the other end of the penthouse. I did not see him that first evening. I arrived with a small selection of my own belongings. Most of my things were still being moved, managed by people I hadn't met yet, and Han Seri showed me the kitchen and the rest of the space with the brisk efficiency of a tour guide who had a schedule to keep. The kitchen, at least, was excellent. The first weeks were a study in careful, mutual distance. Moonbin left before 6 in the morning every day and returned after 9 at night, and sometimes later. He was, as he had warned me, rarely at home. On the days I saw him at all, it was a brief intersection in the kitchen, me making coffee, him walking through in a suit, already in motion, never stopping long enough for conversation. He ate, I noticed, inconsistently. He would return at 10 at night and take whatever he found in the refrigerator and eat it standing over the kitchen counter with no discernible interest in the meal as an experience. He ate for fuel the way someone fills up a car, efficiently and without sentiment. This was something I found unexpectedly, personally offensive. After 2 weeks of this, I started leaving food in the kitchen for him. Proper food, not the leftovers from my own dinner, but dishes I made specifically for the hours he came home. Slow-braised galbi that could sit at temperature for hours. Doenjang jjigae in a covered pot on low heat. Juk for the nights when he looked, in the brief glimpse I caught of him, particularly tired. He ate it. All of it every time. He never commented. I never asked. But the galbi started disappearing every night and I took that as enough. The nights were the strange part of that early period. I was sleeping in a bedroom I hadn't chosen in a home that didn't yet feel like mine, in a bed that was too big and too quiet, married to a man I barely knew who existed on the other side of a very large penthouse. The city lights came through the curtains even at 3 in the morning, that particular Seoul orange that never fully went away, and I lay awake sometimes longer than I meant to, thinking about the journey from room 4B in Hansung Children's Home to here. It was objectively absurd. But there was something about the absurdity that I was learning to hold lightly. I had been told my whole life, through every year of not being chosen, that I was a person who did not fit anywhere. And here I was in a place that didn't fit me yet, but that hadn't specifically excluded me either. Yet I told myself, it doesn't fit yet. The distinction felt important. Harabiajanim died 2 months into our marriage. He had been declining since shortly after the wedding, quickly enough that I wondered afterward if the ceremony itself had been the last thing he had been holding on for. He went quietly in the early morning in his own bed in the Park residence, with Kim Jinho and Mrs. Yeo present, and I was told later, with a particular peace on his face. I heard the news from Jinho SSI directly. I was in the penthouse kitchen making breakfast when my phone rang. I stood very still for a long moment after I hung up. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and let myself feel it, the particular grief of losing someone who had been, in the brief strange time I had known him, the closest thing to a loving grandfather I had ever had. Someone who had seen me and chosen me and believed in me. I made his juk recipe from memory and ate it alone at the table. I heard Moonbin leave for the Park residence before 8 that morning. He did not speak to me on the way out. He was a shape in the periphery of my vision, dark suit, closed face, moving with the contained force of someone holding something enormous very tightly. He did not return that night, or the next. He returned on the third day and I heard him come in at 2 in the morning. I was awake, I had been sleeping poorly, and I lay very still in my room and listened to the sounds of him moving through the penthouse. Cabinet opening. Blast. The sound of water. Then silence for a long time. Then, very faintly, something I almost wasn't sure I heard. I got up. I went down the corridor very quietly in my socks and loose sleepwear. The kitchen and living room were dark except for the city lights coming through the windows, and Moonbin was sitting on the floor in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows with his back against the glass and his arms on his bent knees, looking out at Seoul. He still had his suit on. He had been in it for 3 days. He did not look up when I came in. But he didn't tell me to leave either. I went to the kitchen and turned on only the small light over the stove. I put water on. I made 2 cups of the plain green tea I knew Harabiajanim had preferred because that felt right. I carried them to the living room and sat down on the floor a few feet from him, against the wall, and put 1 cup within his reach. He looked at it. Then he picked it up. We didn't speak. We sat in the dark and drank tea and looked out at the city, and somewhere in that silence something shifted between us. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the way that things sometimes shift in the quiet of a shared grief, when 2 people who don't know each other very well find themselves accidentally sharing the weight of the same loss. After a long time, Moonbin said very quietly to the window, "He was the only person who was never afraid of me." I let that sit for a moment. "I wasn't afraid of you," I said. He turned his head and looked at me with those black eyes, and in the low glow of the city lights his face was very still and very bare in a way I had not seen before. "You should have been," he said. "Probably," I agreed. "But I'm not." Something moved across his face, complex and brief. Then he looked back at the window. "He thought very highly of you," he said. "I know," I said. "I thought very highly of him." Another silence. "He said you cook with your whole heart," Moonbin said. "He said that to you?" "In the letter he left me." Pause. "He left me instructions. Regarding you. Regarding our marriage. Regarding—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "He had opinions about everything, my grandfather?" "He did," I agreed. He said. Moonbin stopped again, and I had the sense of watching someone run up against the edge of something they hadn't meant to approach. "He said to treat you well." "Okay," I said simply. "I intend to." "I know," I said, and I meant it because somehow, despite everything about Moonbin that was opaque and controlled and difficult to read, I did know it. Whatever he was not a man who broke his word. Not to the people who mattered to him. He finished his tea. I finished mine. He got up eventually without ceremony and went to bed. But in the morning, for the first time since I had moved in, he sat down at the kitchen table while I was making breakfast and stayed long enough to eat. I learned Moonbin the way I learn any complicated thing, slowly by paying attention. He drank his coffee black, no sugar, very hot, and the quality of the beans mattered enormously to him, though he would never articulate it in those terms. He simply drank 1 cup quickly if the coffee was adequate and 2 cups slowly if it was excellent. I calibrated accordingly. He worked with a focused ferocity that seemed to leave him, on some evenings, completely emptied of social capacity. On those nights he needed silence more than food, and I learned to read the specific quality of his silence. The kind that meant leave me alone and the kind that meant I don't need conversation but I don't mind company. The latter was more common than I had initially expected. He had, I discovered, a very dry wit. It emerged rarely and without warning, usually in the form of a deadpan observation that landed so precisely it took me a moment to realize I wanted to laugh. The first time it happened I was washing dishes and he was standing at the kitchen counter reading documents, and he said without looking up, "You have been reorganizing the spice cabinet." "Yes," I said. "It was organized before." "It was organized alphabetically," I said. "I reorganized it by culinary application." "Ah." He turned a page. The garlic powder was very upset about the relocation. I stopped washing dishes. I turned around. He was still reading his documents. "Did you just make a joke?" I said. "I never make jokes," he said and turned another page. I turned back to the dishes and I smiled at the kitchen window and I made sure he didn't see it. But after that I listened for those moments. They were quiet, they were rare, and they were always unexpected. And I found that I was listening for them in a way that meant I was paying attention to him more than I had realized. He, in turn, was paying attention to me. I caught it in small ways, the way he sometimes adjusted his schedule infinitesimally, on the nights I had gone to the trouble of making something that required being served at a specific time. The way he occasionally asked, with no preamble, what I was making, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a few minutes watching me work before disappearing again. The way, one afternoon when I had cut myself slicing vegetables, a stupid, embarrassing accident, he appeared in the kitchen without being called and looked at my hand with an expression of focused concern that was completely disproportionate to a small kitchen cut. "Let me see," he said. "It's fine," I said. He took my hand anyway, just reached out and took it, his fingers wrapping around my wrist, and turned my palm up to look at the cut. His hands were large and warm and extremely gentle in a way that completely contradicted everything else about him, and I was very aware of the contact and very carefully not reacting to it. He cleaned the cut with the first aid kit from the bathroom, which he knew the location of with the ease of someone who had had occasion to use it himself, and applied a small bandage with a precise efficiency that I found, unexpectedly, very touching. "There," he said and let go of my hand. "Thank you," I said. He nodded and walked away. I stood in the kitchen for a moment with the bandaged hand and a very strange feeling in my chest. She came on a Thursday in March. I was alone in the penthouse. Moonbin was at the office, Hansari was with him, and I had the afternoon free. I was in the kitchen experimenting with a new recipe when the front desk of the building called to say there was a woman downstairs asking for me. "For me?" I said, surprised. "I didn't receive visitors." "She says she's your mother," the desk attendant said. The word hit me somewhere below the sternum, like a blow I'd known intellectually was coming but hadn't braced for in time. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding the phone, and told myself to breathe. "Send her up," I said. I don't know what I expected. The file I had read at 16 had told me almost nothing useful about Han Jisoo beyond the bare facts of the relinquishment. I had no face for her in my head, only an absence, a shaped void where a mother might have been. The woman who stepped out of the elevator and into the penthouse foyer was 48 years old, though she looked older. She was thin in a way that health doesn't produce, and her skin had the particular grayish pallor I had come to associate, from brief research into addiction when I was 19 and trying to make sense of my own origin story with long-term substance use. She was wearing decent clothes, nicer than I might have expected, and she had my eyes, or I had hers. They were the same shape, the same darkness. It was deeply disorienting. She looked at the penthouse around her with an expression that moved quickly from stunned to calculating. Then she looked at me. "Young Sana," she said and smiled. Something in me went completely cold. She told me she had seen the announcement of my marriage in the news, Moonbin's marriage technically, which had been a minor item in the financial press. Moon Corporation CEO Park Moonbin marries in private ceremony. My name had appeared in one line. She had recognized it. She had found me. She sat in my living room, the living room of a man whose name I had taken, in a home I was still learning to call mine, and she told me she wanted to reconnect. That she had thought about me. That she had regretted things. She said the words with a smoothness that suggested she had rehearsed them, and underneath them, underneath the performed sincerity, I could see the calculation in her eyes every time they moved to the apartment around her, tallying the worth of everything they landed on. "I've changed," she said. "Have you?" I said. She blinked. Something flickered behind her expression. "I'm in recovery," she said. "I've been working on myself. I just thought, now that you're settled, now that you're doing so well, maybe we could try to have a relationship." I looked at her across the coffee table. 28 years. She had left me in an orphanage at 3 weeks old and had not, as far as I could tell from any record or lack thereof, once inquired after me. Not one visit. Not one letter. Not one phone call to the state social services that would have connected her to whatever institution I was in. "What do you want?" I asked. She looked wounded by the directness of it. I told you I want to reconnect. I want to. What do you actually want? I said. Be honest. Please. Pause. The wound expression faded and something more pragmatic replaced it. I'm in some difficulty, she said. Financially. Just temporarily. I thought since you're, she gestured at the apartment. Clearly doing well now, maybe you could help. Just until I get sorted. There it was. I felt in that moment very tired. Not angry, the anger came later. Just an enormous bone-deep tiredness. I'll give you something, I said, because I couldn't look at the woman who had my eyes and refuse her entirely, because I was apparently that kind of person. To help. But I need you to understand that I can't be the solution to recurring problems. I have limits. She smiled. She had gotten what she came for. She left 20 minutes later with an envelope of cash I took from the household account, and as the elevator doors closed behind her, I stood in the foyer of Moonbin's penthouse and felt very small and very old at the same time. She came back. Of course she came back. She came back 6 weeks later, and then 3 weeks after that, and each time the amount she needed was larger than the last, and each time the emotional pressure was a little more calculated, a little more pointed at the specific places she had apparently quickly learned I was most vulnerable. She told me I owed her. She said she had given me life, as if that alone, the bare biological fact, erased the years of silence and abandonment that had followed it. She said if I didn't help her she would go to the press about Moonbin's Omega husband coming from nothing, as she put it, as if my origin were shameful, as if the orphanage and the struggle were things I needed to hide. The worst part was that I was already hiding them. Not from guilt, but from a reflexive privacy I had built over years of being the boy people hadn't chosen, the person without a family story. I had not told Moonbin any of it. I had not told him about the orphanage. He knew the bare facts from the background the lawyers had assembled, but none of the texture of it, none of the emotional weight. I had not told him about my mother because to tell him would require explaining what it had felt like to grow up knowing I had been thrown away, and that was not something I knew how to hand to a person I was still learning to trust. And so when she threatened to tell him, I paid. Again and again. I paid from my own account first. I had some savings from years of work, and then, when that began to run low, I found myself doing complicated calculations in my head about what I could take from the household allowance Moonbin had set up without it being visible. The stress of it accumulated the way debts do, quietly at first and then all at once. It happened on a Wednesday evening in May. She had called me twice that day already, and each time I had not answered, and she had sent messages, 8 of them, increasing in intensity, culminating in a voice note where her voice was hard and demanding in a way she had never let me hear quite that directly before, telling me that if I didn't respond she would show up at Moonbin's company building and make a scene. I was in the kitchen when I listened to it. I had been making dinner, something careful, something I had been looking forward to making, a slow-braised recipe that required attention and had been occupying me pleasantly for 2 hours. I had my hands wet from the sink and my phone in my hand, and the voice note played through the speaker, and I stood there and listened to my biological mother threaten me. Moonbin was in the study. He had been working late again, and I had been making dinner so there would be food when he was done, which was something I did reflexively now without consciously planning it. I put my phone down on the counter. I turned the heat off under the pot. I stood in the kitchen for a very long moment, and the thing that broke, the thing I had been holding together through months of visits and payments and mounting demands and the constant grinding weight of a secret I hadn't asked to keep, cracked from bottom to top and let go. I sank down against the kitchen cabinets and sat on the floor and I cried. Not quietly. Not in the controlled, private way I had cried through most of my life. The tears you teach yourself to produce silently in a bunk bed at midnight so the kids in the surrounding beds won't hear you. This was different. This was the kind of crying that has been building for years and finally stops caring about being quiet, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and central and demands everything at once. I cried for myself because no one had ever really done it for me. I cried for the 5-year-old standing at the window. I cried for the 12-year-old who had been almost chosen and then wasn't. I cried for the 18-year-old with 30,001 in one bag. I cried for every year I had spent being strong and capable and fine because there was no alternative, because weakness in my situation meant drowning, and I had been too afraid to drown. I cried because she had come back. Not because she loved me, not because she had looked for me out of guilt or grief or any of the things I had quietly, secretly, humiliatingly still half hoped for, but because I was useful now, because I was attached to money, because I was, to the person who had made me, a resource. She was my mother and she had never, not once, wanted me for any reason that had anything to do with me. I put my face in my hands and I said it out loud, alone in the kitchen, sobbing into the floor. She never loved me. She never even looked for me. She left me and she never looked back and she never. My voice broke on the last word. and she never even wanted to know if I was alive. The silence after was enormous. And then I heard, from very close, a sound, and I looked up. Moonbin was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was still in his work clothes. His jacket was off, his sleeves pushed to his elbows, and he was looking at me on the kitchen floor with an expression I had never seen on his face. Not pity, I would have recoiled from pity. Not discomfort, though you might have expected that from a man who was not practiced in the landscape of other people's emotions. It was something more careful than either of those. Something that looked, in the low kitchen light, very much like I see you. I scrambled to get up because the position was undignified and the crying was ongoing and I hated being seen like this, hated it. Don't, he said. Just that word quietly but with a weight that stopped me. I stopped. He came into the kitchen. He sat down on the floor across from me, this man who wore 300,001 suits to his own home, and sat against the opposite cabinets and looked at me without looking away. Tell me, he said. It's nothing, I said, which was so obviously untrue as to be embarrassing. Young Sunday. His voice was low and very steady. Tell me. And somehow I did. I told him about the orphanage. About room 4B and the window and the couple who chose someone else. About 18 and the duffel bag and the 30,001. About working and studying and the small studio apartment in Siademan that was mine in a way no space had ever been mine before. About my mother coming, finding me after the marriage announcement, and the demands and the payments and the threats. I told him all of it. My voice broke in several places. The tears did not stop. I was an undignified mess on his kitchen floor and I told him the whole accumulated weight of it, all the things I had carried alone because I had always carried everything alone, because there had never been anyone else to carry them with me. Moonbin listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer hollow reassurances or shift uncomfortably or look at his phone. He sat against those kitchen cabinets and he listened to all of it, and when I finally stopped talking and wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater, the silence that followed was different from the silence before I had spoken. It was full somehow. The way a room feels after music has been played in it for a long time. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, quietly and with a deliberateness that left no room for interpretation, "That will stop." "She's my mother," I said reflexively. "She is the woman who gave birth to you," he said. "There is a distinction." Something in my chest, very tired, agreed with him. "I'll handle it," he said. "Moonbin. Young Sunday." He said my name in a way that was not harsh but was very absolute. "I will handle it." And because I was too wrung out to argue, and because some part of me, the exhausted, scraped-down part that had never had anyone who would simply handle things on my behalf, wanted very badly to believe him, I nodded. He got up then. He went to the refrigerator, looked inside for a moment and took out the cold water I kept there. He poured 2 glasses and brought them back and put one in front of me. He sat down again, a little closer this time. We sat on the kitchen floor together, and he waited while my breathing evened out, and neither of us spoke for a long time. "I burned the galbi," I said eventually because the smell had occurred to me. "I know," he said. "I was making it for." "I know," he said again, and there was something in his voice that was so careful and so deliberate in its gentleness that it made my throat tight all over again. "I don't usually fall apart like this," I said. "I know that too," he said. I looked at him sideways. His profile in the kitchen light was severe and angular and extraordinarily familiar now, after months of sharing a space with him. I had mapped every line of that face without meaning to. I knew the set of his jaw when he was working through something difficult, and the way his eyes moved when he was amused even if his face did not change, and the precise angle of his posture in the evenings when he was tired versus when he was merely settled. I had not realized until this moment on the kitchen floor how completely I had learned him. He turned his head and found me looking. I did not look away. He looked back at me and the look went on just a beat longer than it needed to, and something happened in the space between us that was quiet and unannounced and entirely new. Then he said, "Go wash your face. I'll call for delivery." And the moment passed and I went to wash my face, and we ate delivery ramen at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, and it was the most comfortable I had felt in the penthouse since I had moved in. He went to see her the following week. He did not tell me he was going. I found out afterward, 2 days afterward actually, when Kim Jinho mentioned it in passing, apparently unaware that I hadn't been informed. Moonbin had gone to the address my mother had given me for calls, a small apartment in Jangyo with Han Seri and one of his security staff. He had gone in the evening, unannounced. When I confronted him about it, calmly because I was choosing to be calm, he looked at me without a trace of apology. "You should have told me you were going," I said. "Would you have let me?" he said. "That's not the point." Young Sunday. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, still in his work clothes at 7 in the evening. He looked at me with those black eyes that gave away almost nothing and everything simultaneously. She's using you as a resource. She threatened my husband. Those are both things I will respond to. The manner and timing of my response are my business. She's my mother, I said for the second time, and for the second time it rang slightly hollow. What did you say to her? I asked instead. He set down his coffee cup. I told her that her interactions with you are over, that she should reflect on what it means to call herself a mother when she has not in any way performed the role, that she has two options, to stay away and live her life without interference from me, or to continue this behavior and discover exactly how long my patience is. And if she doesn't listen? She'll listen, he said with a finality that was not a threat so much as a fact. I looked at him for a long moment. You can't go around fixing my problems without telling me, I said. Something shifted in his expression. He looked at me steadily. You have been carrying this alone since she appeared. You didn't tell me for... He paused. How long? For months, I said. For months? He repeated, and the way he said it was so carefully contained that I could feel the edges of the thing he was not saying, a quality of reprimand that was not directed at me but at himself, the way a person might be quietly angry at having missed something they should have seen. I didn't want to, I started. I know what you didn't want, he said, and he did. He knew all of it now, the whole architecture of my self-reliance. But you are not living in that apartment in Sia Demon anymore, young Sana. You are married to me. Your problems are... He stopped. Recalibrated. You don't have to carry things alone anymore. He said it the way he said everything, direct and unadorned, without performance or sentiment. But it landed in me with the full weight of what it meant, and I had to look away for a moment at the kitchen window and the night sky beyond it, because I was 28 years old and no one had ever said that to me before. You don't have to carry things alone anymore. I breathed. Okay, I said. Okay, he said. Yes. I looked back at him. Thank you for handling it. Even if you should have told me first. The corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. Noted, he said, and picked up his coffee. The weeks after that were different. Something had been established in the kitchen floor conversation, in the telling and the listening and the sitting together in the dark. A foundation that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there in nascent form and was now something more solid. A ground on which we could stand. Moonbin began coming home earlier. Not dramatically, not every night, but sometimes. Sometimes he came home at 7 instead of 9, and on those evenings he occasionally stood in the kitchen doorway in the way he had developed, watching me cook, and sometimes spoke and sometimes didn't, and I cooked and sometimes spoke and sometimes didn't, and it was easy in a way that I hadn't expected things between us to become. He ate properly now. Real meals at the table, sitting down. He ate with a kind of focused attention that I found flattering as someone who cooked. He experienced food. I realized he simply had never before had access to food worth experiencing. He began having opinions about it. He told me once, with characteristic brevity, that my doenjang jjigae was the best he had ever tasted. He said it so simply and so directly, with no qualifier or equivocation, that I had to put down the ladle and recover for a second before responding. Harabiajanim used to say the same thing, I said. He was right, Moonbin said, and ate more of it. I had also by then begun to understand the texture of his silences, which were not all the same. There was the working silence, focused, absolute, impenetrable. There was the tired silence, slightly heavier with a quality of something released at the edges. There was the thinking silence, which involved a particular set to his jaw. And there was a new one, a silence I had started to notice in the evenings when we occupied the same space without agenda, that was restful, inhabited. The kind of silence that people share only when they have become comfortable enough with each other to stop filling the space with sound. He started doing something that utterly undid me in its ordinariness. He started making tea when he got home. Not asking me to make it, not ringing for anything. He would come in, take off his jacket, hang it over the chair in the hallway and put the kettle on himself. And he would make 2 cups. And he would bring one to me wherever I was. The first time he did it, I stared at the cup for a full 5 seconds before I managed to say thank you. I know how you like it, he said, already turning away. He did know. He had paid attention. I fell in love with him without meaning to and without, for a while, entirely knowing it. It arrived the way these things apparently do, not in one moment of revelation but in an accumulation of small certainties that eventually added up to something undeniable. The way my attention went to him automatically every time he was in the room. The way his morning silences felt companionable rather than isolating. The way his rare, dry humor landed in me like light through a window, completely and every time. The way I found myself, in the middle of the working day, wondering what he was doing, whether his meeting had gone well, whether he had eaten. The way when he sat close to me on the sofa one evening, close enough that his arm was nearly against mine, both of us reading, the lamp between us, I became very aware of the warmth of him and very carefully did not acknowledge it and also could not stop being aware of it. The way he smelled. Dark and warm and very specifically him, beneath the cologne and the professionalism, an alpha scent that I had been carefully not responding to for months but that had been quietly, persistently, working its way under my well-maintained defenses regardless. I was an omega who had been on suppressants for 8 years. I had managed my biology with the methodical self-discipline I applied to everything else. But suppressants do not suppress feeling. They suppress biological reaction. The feelings were mine and entirely my own. I sat with them quietly for a while in the way I had sat with most difficult things, examining them carefully, not panicking, figuring out what I was going to do about them. It happened on a Saturday in June, which was a day that had no particular reason to be significant and was, nonetheless, entirely so. We were in the kitchen together. Moonbin, unusually, had the morning free, some meeting had been postponed, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with his tablet while I cooked. He had eaten breakfast and had not moved, which meant he was staying not because he needed to be there but because he chose to be, and I had made a decision not to examine that too closely. I was attempting a new banchan, a delicate perilla leaf preparation that required precision, and I was doing something wrong because the flavors weren't balancing, and I was frowning at the bowl and trying to work out what I'd missed. "What's wrong with it?" Moonbin said without looking up from his tablet. "I don't know," I said. "It's not right." He set down the tablet. He got up, came around the kitchen counter and stood beside me looking at the bowl. He was very close, our arms nearly touching, the warmth of him a presence I was acutely aware of. "May I?" he said and gestured at the spoon. I handed it to him. He tasted it carefully. He considered. He said, "It's the balance of sweet. You've been conservative with the sugar. I didn't want it to be too sweet. It needs the contrast. Here." He reached past me for the small dish of sugar on the counter, reaching across me, his arm briefly crossing my field of vision, his shoulder almost against mine, and added a small amount, then took the spoon and stirred. He tasted it again. "Try," he said and held the spoon toward me. I took the spoon from his hand. Our fingers overlapped for a second, his over mine on the handle, and neither of us moved for just a beat longer than the exchange required. I tasted the banchan. It was better. He was right. I looked up at him. He was already looking at me and we were close. Much closer than we usually were in the kitchen, the counter at my back and him directly in front of me, only the small distance between us filled with something that had weight. His eyes were very dark and very still. "Better?" I said. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that. "Yes," he said, and he was not talking about the banchan. I was almost certain of it. He stepped back. He went back to the table. I turned to the counter and finished the banchan with my heart doing something I chose not to categorize. The first kiss arrived like a tide that had been building for a long time and finally ran out of shore. It was a month later. We had been, tentatively, without formal declaration, without either of us naming it, edging toward each other in the way of two people who are afraid to break something by moving too fast. I caught him looking at me sometimes in the evenings, with an expression that he would neutralize the moment he noticed me noticing. I sometimes put my hand near his on the table, and sometimes he did not move his away, and we would both look at whatever we were ostensibly looking at and be entirely elsewhere. It happened in the living room on a Thursday evening. We were watching something on television, a documentary he had put on without much comment that I had ended up more invested in than him, and we were on the sofa with the appropriate, careful distance between us, and at some point that distance had narrowed without either of us specifically doing it, and at some further point Moonbin's arm had moved along the back of the sofa behind me. I was not leaning into it. I was also not leaning away from it. The documentary ended. Neither of us moved to do anything about the television. "Young son," he said. I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me and his expression was open. Not in the way of someone who has decided to perform openness, but in the way of someone who has simply stopped closing. Who has let the armor rest for a moment and is showing you what's underneath. He began and stopped. This, I realized, was difficult for him. Not impossible. Moonbin did not have impossible, but genuinely difficult, the same way the softness was difficult, because no one had required him to find it before and so he had not practiced it and was now operating without a guide. "I know," I said softly. His eyes moved over my face, very slowly, the way he moved over things he was trying to fully understand. "You know," he said. "Yes," I said, and I did. I knew because I had been learning him for 9 months, and I knew every frequency of his silences and every register of his expression and exactly what it looked like when Moonbin was feeling something he hadn't yet figured out how to say. He exhaled. Just slightly. Then he moved. It was slow, deliberately, carefully slow, the way he did most things once he had decided to do them, with complete intention and without unnecessary hesitation. He raised one hand and curved it against the side of my face, his palm warm against my cheek, his thumb moving once across my cheekbone in a gesture so gentle it bore no relationship to anything I had previously associated with him. I was very still. My heart was doing something complicated and the warmth of his hand against my face was enormous and real in a way that everything about this moment was enormous and real. "May I?" he said, quiet and low, and his eyes were looking at my mouth. "Yes," I said. He kissed me. And it was not the delicate first kiss of people who do not know each other. It was the first kiss of people who have been circling something for months and finally arrived at it, who know each other's silences and morning habits and the specific quality of each other's laughter, and who have therefore accumulated, without planning to, an intimacy that the kiss was only giving a name to. His mouth was warm and deliberate and the hand against my face moved to curve into my hair, tilting my head slightly, and I made a sound I hadn't planned on and leaned into him and kissed him back the way I had been wanting to for longer than I had admitted to myself. The warmth of him was enormous. His scent, that dark, specific warmth, was not something I was filtering anymore. I had let my suppressants run out the previous month and not renewed them, and that decision had apparently made itself before my conscious mind had caught up, because being here with him felt like the only place I had ever specifically wanted to be. When we broke apart, it was slowly. His forehead came down to rest against mine and we stayed like that for a moment, breathing, close, his hand still in my hair. "Young son," he said very quietly. "Moonbin," I said back. He made a sound that might in any other register have been a laugh. Then he kissed my forehead once, deliberate and complete, and sat back and looked at me. "I am not practiced at this," he said, and it was the most honest I had ever heard him be about anything. "I know," I said. "Neither am I." "Then we'll figure it out," he said, and it sounded less like a sentiment and more like a project plan, which was so entirely him that I laughed, genuinely, helplessly, and he looked at me with the expression that I had privately decided was his version of smiling. Those dark eyes warmed from within and I thought, "Oh, I'm in love with you." I thought it simply and completely and without any of the complicated self-protective scaffolding I usually built around soft things. Just, "I'm in love with you." There is a particular quality to a relationship that has moved from arrangement to reality. It has a different weight to it, a different warmth. It occupies space differently. We were, for the first time, truly married. Moonbin was not a demonstrative man by any calculation. He did not become someone else when he fell in love. He remained himself, precise and controlled and requiring more attention to read than most people gave him, but if you were paying attention as I was, the love was visible in everything. It was in the way he arrived home earlier, more often, with greater consistency. In the way he asked me questions. Real questions, not the polite inquiries of social performance but the kind that wanted actual answers. "What were you working on today? Did you sleep well? What are you thinking about?" In the way he sat with me in the evenings with his shoulder against mine and let the contact be what it was, without comment or ceremony. It was in the physical language that developed between us, that private vocabulary of closeness that couples develop when they have decided that closeness is what they are. His hand finding mine in the kitchen. The way he pressed his mouth to my temple some mornings, brief and certain, before he left for work. The evenings when he came home late and I was already on the sofa reading and he sat beside me and simply leaned, slightly, against me and I leaned back and we read in our separate books in our shared quiet. It was in the night, when the distance between our rooms, which had always been the whole length of the penthouse, began its gradual migration. The first night he appeared in my doorway at 2 a.m, I sat up in the darkness and looked at him. He was in the clothes he slept in, plain, dark, and he was just standing there, with the expression of a man who has decided something and is surprised to find himself having decided it. "Can't sleep," he said. "Come in," I said. He came in. He lay down beside me on the too large bed, above the covers, and we both stared at the ceiling in the dark for a while, and then he said very quietly, "Tell me something." "What kind of something?" "Anything. Something about before. Before all of this." So I talked. I told him about the orphanage in more detail than I had before, not the painful parts, the good parts, the things that had been beautiful even in that life. The kitchen, and the cook who had let me help, and the way the courtyard looked in the first snow of winter, and the small boy I had looked after when I was 15 who had been eventually adopted by a young couple and had looked back at me from the doorway with enormous, shining eyes. I talked until my voice grew soft and slow, and at some point Moonbin's hand had found mine on top of the blanket, and his fingers laced through mine, and we lay there like that in the dark until I drifted off. When I woke in the morning he was still there. He was already awake, lying on his back looking at the ceiling with his measured, considering expression. When I stirred he turned his head and looked at me with those black eyes, and the morning light was coming in around the curtains and his face was unguarded in the way of early morning, and I thought he was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning," he said. I made breakfast. He sat at the table and read the news on his tablet. The city moved outside the windows. Everything was familiar and everything was completely new, and the two of those things together felt like exactly the right kind of life. The intimacy between us deepened the way the best things deepen. Gradually, with attention, with honesty. Moonbin was not a man who performed feeling. When he touched me it was because he wanted to, and because he wanted to he did it with a completeness that left no room for uncertainty. He kissed me like a man who has decided the thing he most wants to do in a given moment is kiss me, and devotes himself entirely to the decision, and the whole weight of his considerable focus was, I had no word for it that wasn't embarrassingly inadequate, extraordinary. There were evenings when we sat together on the kitchen counter, my legs hanging down, his hands bracketing my hips, talking about nothing and everything, the city lights below us and his face so close to mine that I could see every detail of it, and he would look at me with those bottomless dark eyes and say, without preamble, "You are," and then not finish the sentence. "I am what?" I said the first time. He looked at me for a long moment and then he said very precisely, "Significant." "Significant," I repeated. "Yes." He said it as a statement of fact, in the same tone he might report a financial assessment, and somehow that made it the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. "So are you," I told him. The corner of his mouth, the dark eyes warming. He kissed me then, softly, his hand coming up to cup my face the way it always did, as if my face were something worth holding carefully. I had been left by the only person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. I had grown up without being chosen. I had arrived at 28 carrying the full weight of a life lived entirely alone. And somehow, through an old man in an alley and a dying grandfather's last wish and 9 months of learning and losing and finding each other in the dark, I had arrived at this, at a man who held my face carefully and called me significant, and meant it with everything he had. He told me he loved me on a night in September, a year and 2 months into our marriage. We had just come back from dinner at a restaurant, a real outing chosen by him which was itself remarkable, Moonbin being disinclined to restaurants on the grounds that they involved too many other people in too small a space. He had made the reservation himself, had not told me where we were going, and had appeared in the penthouse doorway at 7 with his coat over his arm and said, "Come on," with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided exactly what the evening is going to be. The restaurant was extraordinary. Small and private in Jangyo, with a chef I had heard of and greatly respected. Moonbin had somehow known this, had either researched it specifically or asked someone. The latter seemed more likely because when had he had time to research restaurants? He had dressed for it, dark coat and a shirt with no tie, his hair slightly different from the work arrangement, and he looked. I had to stop looking at him while the maitre d' showed us to the table because I was going to be visibly absurd about it. Dinner was extraordinary. The conversation was easy and warm and occasionally very funny. Moonbin had, over the past months, allowed his dry humor out in more extended form, and at dinner it was relaxed and dry and perfectly timed, and I kept laughing and he kept looking at me when I did with the expression I had catalogued as his version of delight. On the drive home his hand found mine in the back of the car, and we rode through the lit city like that, not speaking, the silence full. In the elevator of his building he looked at me and I looked back at him and we stood on opposite sides of the elevator for the 41 floors and said nothing, but the air between us had the particular density of something about to be said. In the penthouse he closed the door behind us. I put my coat on the rack. I turned around. He was standing in the middle of the living room with his coat still in his hand, looking at me with an expression I had not seen before, stripped back and genuine in a way that even the recent months of openness had not quite reached. As though he had arrived at a place he had been approaching for some time and had just put his foot across the line. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered to him, direct and without embellishment and with the full weight of intention behind it. No preamble, no softening, no qualifiers. Just the words offered completely. I stood there for a moment. I felt the words land and spread, warm and enormous, into all the places that had spent a very long time being empty. "Moonbin," I said. "Yes," he said. "I know," I said. "I've known for a while." "I know you have," he said. I wanted to say it. I crossed the room to him. I reached up and put my hands on the sides of his face, the way he held mine returned, and I looked at him up close, This man who was frightening and controlled and kind and precise and mine, and I said, I love you. I've loved you for months. I just wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. Something in his face moved, and then he set down his coat very carefully, and he put his arms around me and pulled me in, and I pressed my face into his chest and his chin came down against the top of my head and we stood in the middle of the living room like that, just that, holding, for a long, quiet time. His heart was beating fast. I could feel it under my ear. I had not known his heart could go fast. I'm not good at this, he said quietly to the top of my head. I am aware that I'm not good at it. You're better than you think, I said. You're patient with me. I know what you're doing when you do it, I told him. That's not the same as patience. He was quiet for a moment. What am I doing? He asked. Loving me, I said. In the ways you know how to. With the tea and the listening, and the coming home earlier, and holding my face like it's something worth holding carefully. I paused. You're not good at it, Moonbin. You're just not loud about it. That's different. He held me tighter. I held him back. Outside the penthouse windows, Seoul spread out in all its lit, enormous, beautiful complexity, and I was 28 years old and in love with my husband, and the boy in room 4B would not have believed this was coming. I believed it. I was here for it. I was staying. 3 months later, I discovered I was pregnant. I found out on a Thursday morning, an ordinary morning, coffee on, Moonbin already at the office, the apartment quiet in the way I had come to love it. I had been feeling vaguely unwell for 2 weeks and had attributed it variously to a cold, overwork, and bad sleep, and had been managing it with ginger tea and stubbornness. When the second symptom appeared, a sensitivity to scent so acute that the usual cooking smells in the kitchen were suddenly overwhelming, the possibility occurred to me with a quiet clarity that was less shocking than I might have expected. I bought a test at the pharmacy 2 blocks from the building, came back and sat on the edge of the bathroom sink for 5 minutes afterward, holding it and looking at the 2 lines. Pregnant. I put the test down very carefully on the bathroom counter. I sat on the floor of the bathroom. I thought about Moonbin. About the conversation we had never had about children, because we had arrived at love through such an unusual route that all the conversations people planned before marriage we were having after it, as they became necessary. About what he might feel when I told him. About whether. My phone buzzed. A message from Moonbin. Will you be home for lunch? I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I wrote back, yes. Come home. He arrived at 12:30. I had made lunch, juk, because on difficult or significant days juk was my instinct, the food of care and significance and the quiet marking of occasions. I was standing at the stove when he came in, and he said, Young Sana, in the particular warm low register he used for my name these days, and came to the kitchen and stood in his usual doorway spot. You look pale, he said. Are you unwell? I'm not unwell, I said. Come sit down. He came and sat at the kitchen table. I brought the juk. I sat across from him. I put my hands flat on the table. I'm pregnant, I said. The sentence landed in the kitchen and then in Moonbin, and I watched him process it. The very slight widening of his eyes, the pause in the breath, the stillness that descended over him like something settling. Then slowly he set down his spoon. He looked at me. Pregnant, he said. Yes. How far? I think about 6 weeks. I'll go to the doctor to confirm. But the test is, I looked at him and he was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, entirely new, something vast and still and somewhat overwhelmed. Moonbin, are you? He stopped. He pressed his lips together for a moment, and then he said very quietly, Come here. I got up from my chair. I came around the table and he stood up to meet me and put both arms around me and held me in a way that was different from the usual, tighter, more carefully contained, as if he were holding something extremely important and was very aware of that. His face was in my hair. I felt him breathe, and then again. And then something in his chest shifted and he said, muffled in my hair, Young Sana. Yes. I said. I am, a pause. Another breath. I am very glad. The unsteadiness in his voice, this man who was never unsteady, undid me completely. I hugged him back as hard as I could and he held on, and we stood in the kitchen of our home with the juk cooling on the table and the city outside the windows and a new person somewhere inside me beginning. The months that followed were the most extraordinary of my life. I went to the doctor, confirmed the pregnancy, came home with ultrasound printouts that Moonbin looked at for a very long time in the quiet of the living room, holding them with both hands. He asked questions, practical, specific, the kind that meant he was doing research, thinking ahead, planning, but also one question that was none of those things. Are you happy? He asked, looking up from the printout. Yes, I said. Are you? He looked at the ultrasound for another moment. Then he looked at me. More than I thought possible, he said. He became, during the pregnancy, a study in the particular form his care took. He did not become fussy or overbearing, that was not his nature. But he adjusted the infrastructure of our life with quiet, thorough efficiency. He rearranged his schedule to be home in the evenings. He researched nutrition and sent articles to me, not with instruction but with a question mark, is this relevant? And kept the kitchen stocked accordingly. On the mornings I was sick, he sat with me without saying anything useful, which was exactly the right thing to do and which he somehow knew. He read the pregnancy books. I found one on his bedside table, extensively marked with small notes in his precise handwriting, and I stood there reading his annotations, practical questions, underlined passages, small margin notes like verify with doctor and ask young son about this, and felt a love so complete it was physically acute. One evening in my 6th month, we were on the sofa together, my back against his side, his arm around my shoulders, his other hand resting on the curve of my stomach with a steadiness that was not quite casual but was trying to appear that way. The city lights were coming through the windows and I was drowsy and he was not watching the television at all. I turned my head to look at him. He was looking at his hand on my stomach. Moonbin, I said. He looked up. You're going to be a good father, I said. His face did a series of things I watched with full attention. Something that was surprise and then something that was vulnerability, and then something that was, quietly, completely, in the way he allowed himself to be very occasionally, moved. How do you know that? He asked. Because of how you are with me, I said. You don't perform. You just do. And you pay attention. And you're here. I paused. That's most of it. Being here. He looked at me for a long time. Then he turned back to his hand on my stomach and he said very quietly, my grandfather was the only one who made me feel like I was the right person for something. And now, I said. He looked back at me. Those black eyes warmed from within. Now there are 2 of you, he said. I turned and pressed my mouth to his jaw, just a press of lips against the angle of his face, and felt him go still and then settle, his arm around me drawing me a fraction closer. 3, I said. There are about to be 3. The corner of his mouth. The warming eyes. 3, he agreed. My son was born in May. He arrived on a mild evening when the cherry blossoms had already fallen and the city was in that brief, perfect pause between seasons, and he was small and red-faced and furious about existing in the way of all newborns, and Moonbin held him for the first time with the expression of a man who has encountered something that has entirely defeated all previously effective emotional defenses. He held our son the way he held my face, carefully, completely, with the full weight of his attention. Hi, he said to the baby very quietly. The baby made a small, aggrieved sound. Hi, Moonbin said again, and something in his face, in the face of the most feared man in Seoul, the alpha that no one wanted to be in the same room as, the CEO who had built an empire on force of will, went entirely soft, unguarded, open. I watched him meet our son and I cried, which I had permission to do because I had just gone through labor and also because I was so in love with the both of them that it was simply a matter of physics. Moonbin looked up at me. He looks like you, he said. He has your nose, I said. He has your eyes. He has your stubbornness, I can already tell. Moonbin looked back at the baby, who had stopped complaining and was now staring at the ceiling with the unfocused intensity of someone trying to make sense of an incomprehensible new world. Park Moon-jun, Moonbin said quietly, which was the name we had agreed on, the family name that was now also mine, the given name we had chosen together over many evenings of debate and occasional mild disagreement and the particular pleasure of negotiating something important with someone you love. Park Moon-jun, I agreed. Moonbin sat down beside my bed, our son in his arms, and looked at him for a very long time with an expression I did not try to name because it was too full of too many things. Eventually he looked up at me. Harabiaji would have, he said and stopped. Yes, I said. He would have. A beat of quiet. He would have been insufferably pleased with himself, Moonbin said, and the dry edge of it was undercut by the quality of his voice, which was very slightly unsteady. He would have been right to be, I said. Moonbin nodded once. He looked back at our son. Yes, he said. He would have been right. There are different kinds of home. There is the home you are given, which you did not choose, which may or may not fit you, which may or may not last. There is the home you make for yourself from whatever materials are available. A studio apartment in Siademan, a second-hand wooden chair, the smell of juk on the stove. There is the home that finds you when you are not looking, in the form of an old man in an alley who sees something in you worth returning to. And then there is the home that is a person. I know this now. I know it the way I know things I have lived rather than things I have been told. It is a year since Moon June arrived, and our life has taken on a shape that I could not have imagined and did not deserve and have anyway, which is, I have been slowly learning how the best things usually work. The penthouse has changed. It is warmer now in every sense. There are things on the walls, prints I chose, and a traditional painting Moonbin insisted on acquiring because it reminded him of something in Harabiajanim's house, and Moon June's corner of the living room is a cheerful riot of colors that Moonbin periodically surveys with an expression of resigned acceptance. He has been observed, on multiple occasions, sitting on the floor playing with a baby, which I know from the household staff has become a point of significant private delight among those who have known Moonbin for years. He is different than what people see. He was always different than what people saw. The world looks at Moonbin and sees an alpha who cannot be approached, a man who is all edge and ambition and cold authority. I know the man who makes 2 cups of tea in the evening. The man who reads pregnancy books in the small hours and marks them with careful margin notes. The man who held our newborn son in a hospital room and went entirely soft. He is not easy. He is still demanding and impatient, and his silences are still complicated, and his standards for himself and everyone around him are still extremely high. But he is mine, and I know how to read every register of him, and there is nothing in him I have encountered that I did not choose to stay for. This morning I woke before he did, which is rare. He was asleep beside me. We share a room now, entirely and without ceremony, as if it had always been this way, and the early light was coming through the curtains, and Moon June had not yet made his presence known from the room down the hall, which is small and perfect and has a mobile above the crib that Moonbin assembled, with great care and some quiet profanity, on a Sunday afternoon. I watched my husband sleep for a moment. His face in sleep loses even the small amount of guard he keeps now in our life. He is just himself, unperformed, the lines of his face softened and his breathing slow. I thought about the night I found an old man in an alley. I thought about a promise I made to someone dying, out of gratitude and the inability to say no to kindness, and how the most improbable decision I had ever made had somehow been the rightest one. I thought about room 4B in the window and the couple who chose someone else, and about all the years I had been a person no one chose. Moonbin shifted slightly. His eyes opened. He looked at me directly, the way he always woke, alert immediately, no transition, and then his expression did the particular thing it did when he first saw me in the morning. A settling, a warmth, the specific version of his face that was only for this. "You're awake," he said. "You too," I said. He made a sound that might, from a different man, have been called a grumble. He reached out and pulled me in, one arm, decisive, gathering, and I went willingly, tucked against his chest, his heartbeat steady under my ear. "Moon June will be up soon," I said. "We have 10 minutes, he said. "Moonbin." 15. I smiled against his chest. "He doesn't work on your schedule." "He should learn to," Moonbin said, with the absolute confidence of a man who has not yet had to negotiate with a 1-year-old. I laughed. I felt him, against me, not laugh in his particular way, the stillness that meant he was pleased, the slight tightening of his arm. "Young son," he said after a moment. "I love you," he said, simply, completely. I closed my eyes. I thought about everything that had brought me here, every hard thing and every loss and every ordinary Tuesday that had somehow been the beginning of the next thing. I thought about Harabiajanim's hand over mine at the low table, papery and warm. I thought about standing at the orphanage gate at 18 with 30,001. I thought about an old man sitting in an alley on a cold night, looking helpless, waiting for exactly the right person to come along. I did not believe in accidents. Not anymore. "I love you," I said back. "I've always been going to love you. I just didn't know it yet." He pressed his lips to the top of my head, slow and deliberate and completely certain, the way he did everything that mattered. Down the hall, Moon June woke and began his morning announcement. Moonbin made a sound of profound resignation. I laughed and got up to go to our son. And Moonbin followed because that was what he did now. He followed and I followed him, and we made our way through the days together, in a home that was warm because we had made it warm, in a life that was full because we had filled it. Harabiajanim had said, "I hope life is generous to you in return." It was. It had been generous beyond accounting. And somewhere in the quiet of a city that never fully sleeps, in a penthouse 41 floors above Seoul, a family woke into another ordinary morning, ordinary and extraordinary and completely, improbably, perfectly ours.